I hope you have been able to work through your literature and have been able to write a rough draft of the literature. Having done the literature review, it is now time to identify research gaps and write it down. You may have been in the process of identifying research gaps while you were reading, but now it is time to consolidate your ideas on research gaps and then begin to write it. So, that is what I will help you in this particular session. The first thing is, as we understand, research is a very systematic way of studying and carrying out the learning activity. And therefore, we had a large subject like maybe industrial economics or education economics or health economics. From there, we came down to a topic that was of interest to us. From that topic, we came down to a specific problem that was interesting to us. So we came to what is known as a research problem. Then we learned how to write a research problem. And once we were writing the research problem, the very important activity that you did was asking research questions. So these sequences are over. And once you have asked those research questions, next, you went on to write down research literature, reading literature review, then learned how to ask questions in literature, and finally, you learned how to write a literature review. So you started review, you read the review, you wrote the review, and now I take you to another step. How do we make use of the literature we were reading and convert them into research? We are talking about research gaps. How shall we arrive at research gaps? So let me just read out a few lines here and there for you so that you will get an idea about what these gaps are and how these are written. For example, what have the researchers before you actually studied? That's important for you to list them and call them as research issues for the simple reason that it should not happen that you go to study something that has already been studied. So, how do you keep track of what you have read before? What are those issues that have been studied so that by no chance you make a mistake of studying something that somebody has already studied? It's quite a waste of time to do some research which has been done earlier. So, what we do is first list the research issues that have been done. It could be the earlier research has highlighted several issues related to higher education, ranging from the role of higher education in economic development to increasing income and reducing poverty. So, that one particular sentence encompasses all those issues that the earlier writers have studied. You are aware of them, you have listed it down. You are writing what is the importance of employability of a graduate and higher education. So these are topics that you have studied in the literature, and they are important because that related to your area of study, but at the same time you need to be very clear what are those ideas that they have studied. Take again another example, how the perception on quality differs among different stakeholders. So you are writing now that the earlier writers have understood this particular issue. There have been research on how the perception of quality differs among different stakeholders. That is one they have studied. Or you can say how countries have attempted to lay down some guidelines, both internal and external, to benchmark quality. This has been studied. You have been listing them. Then these will be ideas you can delete from your research gaps. Now, why did I ask you to do that? Very often it is not done, but I have understood that when we list out our research ideas and when we are clear about our research ideas, we will not make the mistake of doing those research issues that has been studied earlier. So we are just listing them down. Now, next, let us see what happens. Let's read one or two examples of research gap. Uh, no study based on Indian firms and its need for training has been found in received literature. Now, suddenly you realize that I was reading about training and in firms. Has there been some study that has examined training in Indian firms? Is there an economic based study on that? No? Okay, so that's one issue that I write down. Then none of these studies have employed a methodology of comparing firm level training in three different kinds of industries with three different kinds of entry level human capital characteristics. So what has happened is there are studies that have been done, but this is what I had in mind. How am I going to collect the data? What kind of sample am I going to do? What is the kind of questions I want to ask? What is the important thing that I want to find out? So that framing of the research question is now giving you ideas. Were those questions that you had in your mind been studied by somebody else? No, it has not been studied. Go ahead and write it down as a research gap. These relationships have not been studied in terms of duration of training and categories of employees. Now, what does it mean? That some things have been studied about training and categories employed, but there is no relationship that has been studied on duration of training. Now, duration, that concept of duration of training becomes a new idea worth researching because the earlier researchers have not examined this particular issue. And then studies on higher education quality and perception on quality by different stakeholders in India has not been not been done in the received literature. So the literature, it could be somewhere in that literature, but as much as possible, I have scanned through all the literature on that subject that was available at a particular time, and it was found that uh, really something relating to what I wanted to study was not available in that literature. So that is how you will be able to pinpoint and get those ideas which were not mentioned in that literature earlier. In Indian conditions, no such studies are available. So something there, but a relative study has been done, a related study has been done, let us say in Thailand or in Korea or in UK or somewhere. But as far as India is concerned, that particular kind of study has not been done. Now, when that particular study has not been done in India, this becomes one of your research gaps. It's you need to be very alert when you read, because when you read this and you keep your research questions in front of you, keep your research statement in front of you, then you will get these questions. Because what happens usually is we keep imagining that we have studied that, we have read that, we know what it is. But as I have always suggested, keep notes with you when you start reading, because these notes, these few sets of notes, especially your research statement and your research questions that you have in mind, keep them ready with you. They will be there with you till the end you complete your research. It's not something you have done and you are done away with. That is the way it will get connected till the end of your research. So keep them with you when you are reading literature. Go back and see, did I miss out something? Was there a question that I had asked and that answer is not available in this paper? All right, if it is not available in the paper, that becomes a research gap in right. So again, here the job is to list down the research gaps. List it down. Don't worry about whether they are right or wrong. Just list down the research gaps that you are able to identify while you're reading. This is a very preliminary stage of identifying your research gaps. You could also say that none of the identified studies have empirically examined something. So, how did they collect their data? What data have they used? Have they used empirical data? Then, overall student quality, perception on and satisfaction. There is no study using data, primary data, on finding out these kind of questions. No study is based on primary data and in the Indian context. Again, these are ideas you have in mind. You had those questions in mind, and now when you read them, you find that those questions have not been asked. Therefore, these kind of being alert to reading and connecting with your research question is the way you will arrive at your research gaps. So, I have written here again for you, revisit your statement on I mean, it's not about revisiting alone, it's about an every time effort to go back to your research statement. Keep remembering it. Revisit the research questions. Otherwise, chances of getting sidetracked are too many, because there are so many kinds of literature you will read. You will forget your direction in which you are planning to move and read things that are not necessary and waste time and get confused at that stage. So get back every time you get swaying to the left and to right, get back to the main thing, because these statements and these questions will show you the direction in which you're going to move ahead, and or carrying out research on areas that have, or otherwise what can happen is, as I said, you will carry research in those areas which has already been done. It's quite a waste of time when you are just going to do what others have done already. Another very important way to identify a research gap is to read the limitations of earlier studies. Go to libraries, read the last section of the research where they write limitations of the study, or topics that can allow for future scope for studies. Those two areas, limitations and future research possible, those two areas will again allow you to identify research gap. What is it that researcher could not do because of certain limitations? What is that research suggests that based on this finding, what are those other kinds of research that can be done in the next course by somebody else? These two areas, research, future research, and limitations of the present study, these are two areas that can again guide you to your research gap. Too many or too few. Identify those research papers in your study which has too many answers to your problem. There are multiple answers to that problem. Then, or too many answers have already been found for that problem, then is it worth researching? That's a question you have to discuss with your research supervisor. And still, after reading all of them, if you can find out something after synthesizing all of them and then finding out research problem, a research gap, go ahead. Otherwise, if you feel that that research area has been studied too many times and too many answers are similar, then it can indicate to you that that's too much of a spent force. There is too much of a research that has already been done. Similarly, you may find some papers that are very few papers on a particular topic. Too few literature, read the limitations. They might have genuine problems in conducting those kind of research. As a PhD scholar or as a master's student, are you willing to take up those kind of researches which has got problems of funding, or which has got problems of travel and things that are related of that kind? So you should be careful about those papers which are very few, and find out why those researchers have not been taken up further. Maybe it is not very relevant, maybe it is not very useful. There is something that indicates. Too many and too few indicate to something about research. So between the two, I think it lies which are those areas which you want to research. Now, identify the gap in knowledge. Now, where does this gap arise in? Gap can arise in geography. I just gave you some examples of India context of my context in terms of the place that I live in, or the region that I live in. Any of these geographical areas can be a reason to carry out research, because geography often throws up very interesting outcomes when it comes to the findings of research. The geography, the soil, the climatic condition, all of that can throw out different kinds of answers. To that extent, you can take geography as a reason for study. Then population. Research in social sciences is done on population, on human beings. So when we study on human beings, you could see the age, a particular age was studied. For example, that same problem was not studied in terms of children. If I talk about nutrition, I could talk about obesity on one hand, I can talk about malnutrition on the other hand, but I can talk malnutrition among children, I can talk malnutrition among pregnant mothers, I could talk about malnutrition among young girls, I could be talking about housewives. So you can have different age groups and compare that and study. You could do it between men and women. So there are a lot of all between old age and youngsters. So there are different ways in which you can look at the demographic profile of that study. So the population or the demographic profile can also throw out very interesting finding when you take up research. It could be the setting, it can be in the urban setting it has been done. Do you want to understand how the same problem can be studied in the rural setting? Housing in the rural areas, housing in the urban areas, water in rural and urban areas, or cooking in rural and urban areas. How do we understand the setting of it? In a city, how does it work? In a village, completely village, far away village, how does it work? So we can think of multiple ways in which we can make our study very distinct, very characteristically new study. And also variables. Sometimes the earlier studies may not have used a particular variable or two which you have identified and you're very keen on using it. So check out for that variable and see whether that variable was of any significance in the earlier study. If that variable is significance has been left out earlier, then it becomes a very interesting thing for you to take up that particular variable and relate it to other variables to study. So when you're reading your literature, you should be very careful that you are able to identify the variables, because these variables will be the ones that you're going to use when you are going to test your field work, you're going to prepare your questionnaire. All these happens based on the variables that you're going to collect. Variables could be age and so many things, whichever idea you take, and if its value changes, you can understand it as variable. And then you can also see whether the data collection methods that was followed in the earlier studies, what was the data collection method they did, what is the data collection method that you are going to use, are you using primary data, are you going to use secondary data, which is the method you want to do. All these can be interesting reasons for research gaps to emerge. You can also talk about the tools that you're going to analyze the data with. You can say the processes that are involved in handling the data. Any of these subjects that can cause anything different from the earlier studies, and you're very distinctly clear about that particular idea, you can keep it for a research gap. The measurement of output. How do you want to measure that output? In the way that traditionally it has been measured, or is there a new way in which you're going to present your outcome? The measurement itself, you're going to change it in some way. You could do that. Then how else? Why so less literature in a topic should be a good question to you. And similarly, why so many, as I just mentioned to you, likely to get confused about this kind of large questions. Uh, Identifying research gap. The question is, what can help you to identify? Besides these tips that I have given you, the next question, that is, what really can I do to get some help of identifying research? I have learned this. How do I know these are really research gaps? So one of the earliest step I would suggest is be curious enough. Curiosity is about researching. You are curious about finding something about the material that you are reading. You want to be creative enough to find a different meaning to what you are reading in terms of your subject, or you are able to imagine something that does not exist, but you want to think it in that term. Or it could be critical thinking. Why is it something like that is happening? Why doesn't it happen that way? Just because everybody has done it like that, should I also do it something like this? Is there another way to do that? So these kind of questions are something that you should repeatedly ask, and you should also learn to judge now something which is done. See, you are, as I told you, you are a reviewer of research that has been done by earlier writers, which means you are significantly capable of judging the quality of the work that they have done. This judging of the quality of the work that you do, is based on your imagination, on your critical thinking, on your ability to judge. All of these together are the ones that can help you to arrive at research questions. Now, I give a lot of importance to the writing of research because, as I told in the last class, what can happen is it can become very cumbersome later when the language is not right. You will have to keep editing that language for the correctness of the language more than other reasons. So, here, the language that is often used is have not been studied, has not been studied, has not been examined, not a part of received literature, conditions, no such studies are available, have not empirically tested it, there are no cross sectional studies. Key question is why hasn't this been done? Then identification of gap in the literature itself has to be the reason for you. And finally, explain how. And after you have identified this gap, the question is how are you going to answer these gaps? That particular statement becomes very important. Now get ready to prepare the research objectives. So having done your research gaps, you are now moving to the next step of your research proposal writing, where you are now talking about what is it that I'm going to do about the gaps that I have identified. So all these processes are interconnected. Now research gaps, these research gaps will become research objectives, and that is how we shall look into the next lesson. So I hope that this presentation made you a little more confident about identifying research gap, and we shall see in the next presentation about writing research objectives using research gaps and research questions. So let's wait for that. So happy learning, happy researching. Thank you.